Father in heaven, Lord, we want to thank you so much, Lord, for this day. We want to thank you, Lord, for each person here tonight. Lord, thank you that we've been able to glean so much, Lord, from this marriage seminar, and we pray that you would continue to be with us. Lord, help us to put these things that we're learning into practice, that our marriages might be enriched to your honor and to your glory, Lord. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right. Okay, all right. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. So welcome again. This is going to be night number 3, where we are continuing through looking at the 7 principles that make marriage work. Now, did anyone have a chance to do some of the activities that were on the handouts since the last time that we were here? Okay, all right. All right. Hopefully those were helpful to you and enjoyable to you. I believe last week we had the handouts on how to be a great listener, how to use those skills to really listen to each other and really hear each other out. So we're hoping that you're putting those into practice, because something that I've had to speak to many of my clients about is that therapy only works when you do it. So we have these 1-hour sessions a week, or maybe 1-hour sessions every other week. And you have 168 hours a week, and I see somebody for one of those. So the other 167 hours are your responsibility. And so I have the same theme here. I mean, we have lots of principles that I believe have been time tested and have been laboratory tested as well, that I believe have demonstrated that these things can effectively help your marriage to be more successful. So I hope you all are practicing in between. All right, so we'll start with questions first. We just had a couple of questions to go through, and Jennifer's going to read those ones for us.
All right, and to remind everyone, thank you.
Yeah.
I guess not. And to remind everyone, both in person and online, if you have any questions, you can either submit them here, or you can submit them on Facebook, or you can contact the church, whatever way feels most comfortable to you. So we did get some questions this past week. One of them being, somebody said, when we have an argument, if I don't say what I feel like I'm being fake. So to not start arguments, I just won't talk sometimes.
Okay. All right. So has anybody ever tried this problem-solving strategy before? Maybe I just won't say anything, and then hopefully it just goes away. Well, that tends to not work very well, because what happens is, even though you're not saying anything, your body definitely knows what you're not talking about. In fact, one of the things that they've demonstrated is that when you suppress certain kinds of emotions, the more you begin to bottle those, the more it begins to show up physically, and it could rapidly increase the amount of stress you're experiencing, increase the amount of cortisol in your system, increase the aging process. And so you may not be saying anything, but your face is, and that's more than just, it's actually not just your face, your body's also going to be telling you something too. Now, what oftentimes needs to happen is not that we just need to hold our peace, we need to find more effective ways to communicate what we're saying. So oftentimes what's happening is that in these perpetual arguments that we haven't delivered the point very well, and often what I'll see is people resort to the same things. And if I have this discussion, I'm thinking of a case where there was a couple that I was working with where the spouse was saying, well, I can't ever really tell you about how I feel, because as soon as I do, you just shut down and you get quiet, and then you do this thing. And I said, well, let's try this a little differently. And I said, significant other, what is it that's happening to you when your spouse starts to talk to you about their problems? Well, they said, well, I start to get really frustrated because I try a couple times to solve the problem, I listen to them, and then the more I listen, the worse it seems to keep getting, and they just get really upset, and then I try to give some input. And I said, well, can you tell me what's happening for you? It's like, well, I start to get really upset because it feels like I can't help them. It feels like I can't reach them, and the more I talk, the more it seems like I'm failing them, and so I just keep my peace. And it's like, well, failing them bothers you, and I go on and say all these things, and eventually the person was able to reflect back that oftentimes I really do care about what you have to say, and I really care about how you feel. And so I said, well, can you share that with your spouse? And they turned around and shared it to the spouse. They said, well, I really care about how you feel, and oftentimes the reason why I stop talking is because I don't want to hurt or disappoint you. And the other person turns around and says, I quote, I don't believe you. So how do you think that discussion went after that? It's like, well, and then they said, see, they don't really listen to me. And it's like, well, you kind of just, they just told you, they kind of tried to open their heart to you a little bit and tell you that, they actually are having some kind of experience when they see you really emotionally elevated, and they say they care, and then as soon as they say that they care, you don't believe them, and then you go back and say they don't listen. So oftentimes, that's the real problem, is something is happening in the communication. It's how it's being delivered, and it's the fact that that person has reasons to not to believe the other person. So it's not like either person is guilty, but what's happened is that more clarification needs to happen. So that's the long/short answer. And if y'all have questions here, please use them. I mean, this is, you get to, for free, ask a therapist any question you want, and I'll definitely try to give you the best of what I can from given my experience.
So there's a part that said being fake.
Oh, being fake, yes. So being artificial isn't necessary. One way to just present it is saying, I have some things I want to be able to talk to you about, but I'm not ready to right now, or I'm not sure if we're in a good place to talk about them. That's not fake. It's a very genuine way to put it out there without sharing everything, but you want to make sure that you're in a good space to hear it. Probably last thing before you go to bed is not the best time to share something like that, nor when you're rushing out the door. That's also not a good time, so finding the right time.
Okay, then the other question, what should we do if we keep fighting about the same things and we can't ever fix it?
Okay, that's actually going to be a question that we'll answer tonight, because one of the things we're going to be looking at is how do you solve seemingly unsolvable problems? Because there's something called, there's two types of problems we're going to be looking at, both of them. There's perpetual problems, and then there are solvable problems. We're actually going to be looking at both of those this evening. All right, so hopefully those answers are helpful for you all, but again, if you have questions, like I said, this is free of charge. You get to just ask any question that you want. Hopefully I have some kind of answer that will be sensible to you all. But that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, is how to solve conflicts. And so I put here as a title here, Converting Conflicts into Connections. There is a principle, I believe, that can actually play itself out in relationships, not just in marital relationships. I believe this is also something that is proven to be true in your friendships, and I also believe that as somebody who is of the Christian faith, I believe that this is something that plays out in the Christian faith as well, that it actually turns out that conflicts are opportunities for connections. Now, I really want you to hold on to that, because if you can recognize that, then you don't have to be afraid of conflicts. In fact, if you can work through the conflict, you will end up closer as a result. Now, I don't know, ladies, if this happens for you all as often, but for guys, a lot of us, how many of you guys, or ladies as well, ended up making best friends with somebody that you got in a fight with? Anybody ever do that? Wow, nobody here. Okay. Well, sometimes what would happen is, two people would get into a little match about who's going to play with the truck, or who's gonna play in this game, or whatever that was, and then these two people would fight each other, and afterwards they became best of friends. Now, if you haven't experienced it, you probably have heard the story. But if you think about why that is, there's a really significant reason why. When you get into a fight with somebody, like a real fight, you are putting everything you can into it, and that other person is too. And you feel like in that moment, you're actually feeling that person give the best of what they have. And if two people can do that in some sort of kind of respectful way, then at the end of it, you actually end up respecting the person who was like your opponent. And you'll see these things happen even with professional fighters and other kinds of people. It's like they get this real respect for the other person, unless they're just kind of, just out for pride reasons and things like that. But sometimes conflicts can be converted into connections, and that's what we're going to be looking at this evening. So as a disclaimer, nothing that we talk about today is to take the place of any kind of counseling or therapy. We're just giving this for educational purposes only, so this will not take the place of that. If professional help is needed, please seek it. But again, we want you to have this information so that you can use it in the way that you see fit. The book that we're going off of, again, is the book, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. So I want to make clear that this is copyrighted material that is originally put out there by John Gottman and written in this, co-authored in this book by Nan Silver, so I want to be clear about that piece too. So those are my disclaimers. So tonight we're going to be looking at 3 major points. One of them is accepting influence. The second one is managing conflicts. And the third is making repairs. Now, did everybody get handouts before you came in? Did everybody grab those handouts? Okay, because one of them is actually going to have some questions that we'll be going over while we're in here, and so I'll be kind of asking some of those live. I was going to put them in the PowerPoint, but it was just going to make for way too many slides. So at some point, when we do get to that point, we are going to be looking at some of the questions there, and we'll practice some of these skills, because I think that's a good way to really get good at them. So again, review, we're looking at the sound relationship house that has these 7 principles upon which marriage is based. In the first 2 meetings, we were looking at building the friendship. It's the foundation. It's why we spent the most time there. That was, building the love maps, sharing fondness and admiration, turning towards instead of away. This next part here is going to be looking at positive perspectives and managing conflict. And on the last night, we will be finishing up with making life dreams come true. This is really going to be looking at the second kind of conflicts that we can get into, and those are ones that seem to be unsolvable problems, but there are ways to get through those as well. And creating shared meaning, of course, being at the very top. All right, so just as a quick review, one of the things that they have found in marriages that are bound for either being miserable marriages or for divorce are the Four Horsemen, which are criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. When those things come up, those become signs that these negative attributes are rolling into the marriage. Now, even happy marriages experience this from time to time. If we get upset enough about something or we're bothered by something, these things can come in from time to time. It's when they move in permanently and there's no ability to repair them that they become the most problematic. Okay, so for the first one, accepting influence. In accepting influence, there is a really powerful connection between your ability to really accept influence from your spouse and your ability to sustain a happy marriage. Now, something that is more and more going by the wayside are traditional homes and values in which, they have the man that was the head of the household and the wife was, keeping the house, that old model of doing things. And even though that is starting to move to the wayside, something that's not moving as quickly to the wayside is this paradigm that one spouse doesn't really have to listen to the other because their ideas are better. That continues to be the case in many homes. Now, in the average heterosexual couple, what you will find is that it is still men often who struggle the most with accepting influence. And one humorous example was, there's Bob and Jim are talking about buying a car. Bob is saying, hey, Jim, I want to buy this car from you. And Jim's like, oh, you should check it out. It's a really good car. He's like, all right, well, I need to take it to the dealer first. He's like, what? You don't trust me? He's like, well, no, I trust you, but my wife would kill me if I didn't actually take it to the mechanic. And he's like, what? You're actually going to listen to your wife? And he's like, yeah, wouldn't you? He said, I didn't, or I don't, or I didn't. And he said, well, what happened? He said, well, I'm divorced. And he's like, you think that might be why? But as even though that's said humorously, that becomes more and more the case. Now, the reason that this focuses on men more so than women is because, on average, women don't tend to have a hard time accepting influence from their husbands. Now, it can flip the other way around, but for the most part, it's men who have the most difficult time accepting influence. Some of these things are biologically rooted. You can see this in the way that children play. In fact, up until about age 7, boys and girls will become like good friends. But after the age of 7, between the ages of 7 and 13, boys tend to only exclusively accept influence from other boys. How many people who have kids have noticed that? Like their best friends kind of shift and like that gender gap begins to show up. Now, it's interesting because little girls don't actually stop accepting influence from boys. It's boys that stop accepting influence from girls. And this is worldwide, regardless of any kind of cultural upbringing. It's just something that seems to be biologically rooted. And they gave one really cute example of it, of two children playing on the playground. And, here it is that, Jim and Sally are playing with trucks. And, he's pushing a truck through the dirt, but she has a baby doll. And so they pretend to be parents of this little child, and it's all going well for a little while until, well, Jimmy gets bored, and then he says, oh my gosh, the baby is dead, we got to take him to the ambulance, so it makes it a boy game, and he's like, all right, let's jump in the car. It's like, woo, and it drives all the way over there. It's like, oh my gosh, he needs to have surgery. I'm going to be the doctor, you be the nurse. And she's like, so I don't have to be a nurse, I can be a doctor if I want to. And so apparently that has changed. And so then they work on the baby, and they resuscitate the child to life, and then it goes back to caring for the infant. And in that humorous example, you see the differences between how boys and girls tend to play, but at that age, there's still some accepting of influence. Now, in one of the questionnaires there, it asks how well you are doing with accepting influence. So how are you doing when your spouse says, that if one person says, when I get home, I just want to unwind and relax, I don't want to go out anywhere, and your spouse says, well, I want to go out to dinner because I'm tired of being cooped up in the house all day. How well can you hear each other, and how well can you come to make compromises on those particular subjects? And so those will be some things to practice. I won't go through all of those. Actually, there was the one handout that I had, and actually I did not bring one up here. Okay, thank you. So my wife is going to generously bail me out and grab me one of those. Yes, so there is the one that talks about accepting influence, and it gives some examples of how to actually do that, how to actually listen to each other, and how to find some middle ground here. So another example that was used here was when you had another couple who had some problems with finances and were really struggling with how to resolve their financial problems. One person kind of operated off the principle of you only live once, consider that YOLO, and the other one operated off a principle that I will very clunkily call YONK, which is you never know what's coming, or you don't know what's coming. So, I had some other acronym for it, so forgive my misspelling of it. So anyway, one of the things that they had to figure out is what was the history behind their spending habits. One really wanted to make sure that they were actually able to live life to the fullest, and the other one wanted to make sure that they were saving up for the apocalypse. And when you have two people who financially plan in this kind of way, it actually can cause a lot of tension and conflict, because one person feels like we never do anything, all we do is save, we pinch pennies, and the other person is just like, feels like the other one just goes on these spending sprees and is totally irresponsible about how they use their finances. So one of the keys that they'd want to get to is how to accept influence from the other person. Now, I believe in the questionnaire that we had here, there was one that talks about some of these perpetual and solvable problems. So did everybody get that one? I think it says, I think that started with, did that start with number 9? We are. Yes, that was the one. Okay, so it must. Okay, all right. So that is the one there. Okay, so we're going to go through that in just a moment here, and we're going to take a look at this one. But before we get to that one, there was another one too that I wanted us to take a look at before we get there. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. All right, so before we get to that one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift over to the managing conflicts, and I think this one will help us to get into this questionnaire that you do have printed out. So in a moment, we'll go through the one, assessing your marital conflicts. So the first step here in managing conflicts is you have to be able to note what kind of conflict you are having. Unfortunately, in these perpetual conflicts that can begin to occur, we can see that these conflicts can fall into this category. Of all the conflicts that couples have, some 69% of them end up being these perpetual conflicts, these ones that actually can become incredibly difficult to negotiate. Now, you can tell the difference between a solvable problem and a perpetual conflict precisely by how long it's been going on. So when they did these studies, they found that when they had these couples talk about a specific issue, like the financial issue I was talking about, when they heard them have the conversation, you couldn't tell if 4 minutes elapsed or 4 years elapsed. Their hair had changed, clothes had changed, everything had changed except the conversation, because it was the exact same one. That becomes a real sign and a clue that you are dealing with a perpetual conflict. There's actually a few identifying markers that let you know that you are experiencing these perpetual conflicts that we call a gridlock. The first one is if the conflict makes you feel rejected by your partner. So if your spouse is not actually agreeing with you, if you feel rejected as a result, that is a sign that this may be a perpetual conflict. The second one is you keep talking about it but make no headway. Hence the 4 years later, it sounds just like you had the conversation 4 minutes ago. The third one is you become entrenched in your positions and are unwilling to budge. This is the stubbornness. Of course, nobody here is stubborn, right? So you become entrenched in your positions and are unwilling to budge. Now, that stubbornness will often come up when the thing that we're really fighting for we hold as a very deep value. I'm not as attached to where I go out to eat as I am attached to whether or not where I go to eat does not either A, cost too much, or B, leave me feeling hungry. So my wife and I, we've come to this agreement that we are not going out to eat somewhere if I'm still going to be hungry afterwards, because that is a complete waste of my time. I just do not understand that. I almost don't even care if the food tastes that great. I just want to make sure I'm full. If I walk out of there hungry, that is a deep frustration for me. That's probably not going to shift or change at all. But there are ways for us to compromise around that one. Now, that's not a perpetual conflict, but it is something that if you have a deeply held value behind it, you're going to fight like it, as though you're going to fight about it as though it like your survival depended on it, which is part of the reason why we get so upset in the first place. Number 4, when you discuss the subject, you end up feeling more frustrated and hurt. So if it's one of those kind of discussions where after you have it, you just find yourself feeling more upset, this is a sign that this may be a perpetual conflict. Number 5, your conversation about the problem is devoid of humor, amusement, or affection. So there was a couple who, whenever they would start to get into a conflict, one of the things that they would do as a repair attempt after they had made several statements to each other is that they knew it when it was coming, because the other person would start to put their hands on their hips. And as soon as they saw that, they knew they had to do it first before the other person did. They put their hands on their hip and stick out their tongue at each other, and just as a way of acting childish. But it would pause the conflict to say, okay, we have to remember that we still love each other, even if we're not getting what we want. Now, in perpetual conflicts, those kind of repair attempts are very difficult to put out there. So when we get to that place where it seems like we can't be humorous about it, we can't interject humor into what's going on, that is a sign that this is a perpetual conflict. Number 6, you become even more unbudgeable over time, which leads you to vilify each other during the conversation, which is one of those four horsemen. And so when we see these 4 horsemen again, it means that we're touching a nerve on something that's held pretty dearly. So if the person gets to the place where we're even more entrenched in our beliefs, then that is showing that it's a perpetual conflict. So when that vilification makes you all the more rooted in your positions and polarized, you become more extreme in your views and all the less willing to compromise. Eventually, you disengage from each other's emotionally. So if it's a conversation that causes you to emotionally distance, again, this is probably a sign that there's a perpetual conflict. But there's a second kind of problems, and these are solvable ones. Solvable problems have the following characteristics. Number 1, when you are dealing, or not the following characteristics, but have the following solutions to them. Number 1, you want to make sure that you have what is called a soft startup. Now, in a soft startup, I believe I mentioned this last time, that some 94% of conversations are going to end the exact same way that they started. So if they start with lots of fireworks and anger, then they're probably going to end that way too, 94% of the time. So if you want a good outcome to your conversation, how would you want to start it? You want to start it on the right foot, right? Because if you want to end on the right foot, you got to start it on the right foot. So a soft startup. Number 2 is learn the effective use of repair attempts. Try to introduce those things into the conversation, such as, I'm sorry I wasn't listening, or I might have missed something, or a repair attempt like being able to say, like, hey, can we slow this down a little bit, or I think I'm starting to feel flooded, or say something to signal to the person, like, I'm here, I'm listening to you, but I also need something from you too. Like, can we make those repair attempts? And sometimes repair attempts aren't just apologies. Sometimes repair attempts are clarifying remarks, but just something to say that you're still engaged. Number 3 is monitor your physiology during a tense discussion after the warning signs of flooding. If your heart rate is getting up somewhere between the 80 and 100 beats per minute range, then it will roughly take you about 20 minutes to be able to calm back down. That's how long it takes your body to regulate itself again. So if you're getting that escalated, then you probably need to stop and pause and step back. Now, it does not mean just shut the conversation down and never talk about it again, but it does mean try to calm yourself down. As a side note, even though we'll talk about this a little bit more in some of the later slides, if you're going to go calm down, you probably should not be trying to allow your thoughts to fall into the 2 major categories. One of them is righteous indignation. Like, that's when you go and sit and say, man, I know I should be mad. I mean, anybody else would be mad in this kind of situation. That's not helpful. You keep going on that, you're just going to stay elevated. Or victimhood, where you can innocent victimhood, where you can look at it and say, man, this person's always attacking me. They don't even try to understand me. That's also not going to help you begin to calm down. You want to pick something that's neutral to shift your attention to so that you actually have that time to calm down. The 4th one is learn how to compromise. So this one is probably fairly self-evident, but find some sort of middle ground where you can both agree. And then number 5 is to become more tolerant of each other's imperfections. So if you're able to do this, then these things can help you begin to solve the problem. So telling the difference is one of the key components that you need to be able to do. You need to recognize if there's an underlying conflict, that it's not about the money, it's about what we're going to do tomorrow. And so going back to these 2 comparisons where you have the one person that says you only live once and the other person says you never know, that's the young one. How do these 2 people compromise and find a way to get together on their opinions? Well, when counseling with, this happens with a lot of couples, and so when I was counseling with them, one of the things that I found is that if there's a perpetual problem, there's probably some kind of underlying experience behind it. So I'll try to change up some of the details of this, but I was talking with a woman who really wanted to make sure that she was able to experience her life to the fullest. And because of that, she wanted to take vacation, she wanted to go and do all these really nice things, and sometimes was not as concerned about how much money she spent. Now, she wasn't just totally irresponsible about it, but really wanted to go and do more things. And so I asked her, it's like, well, where does that come from? Is that something you've always kind of wanted? It's like, well, yeah, when I grew up, we didn't get to do a whole bunch, and beside that, there was actually some things that I had to deal with that really made it clear that life isn't promised. I had a sibling die, I had a lot of my friends that actually died, and then because of my own experience, I was in a situation where, my life kind of went downhill, and I was just surrounded by people who were constantly dying, whether it was by accident and all these other things, and it made it very clear to me that I could be sitting here saving up all my money and then just die with a bank account full of dollars and a life full of unpleasant history, none of which I had any choice over. Now that kind of takes the conversation a different place, doesn't it, about why they want to spend money? Now, this doesn't mean that we should just start blowing all our finances, but once you understand the history behind it, it's like we're not talking dollars anymore, we're talking about tomorrow. And so then I talk to the other person who wants to be very frugal, and then they tell me a similar story. They say, well, when I grew up, my dad was a drunk, and he spent all the money, and even when I got a job at the age of 12, he would spend my money as well, and he'd say, hey, we just need to fix something in the house, and you just take it and go drinking and gambling. And so we never had money. I was always poor. We never had enough to do anything with, and I'm never going back to that again. This is not just being stingy. This is like a fundamental issue. I grew up around this, and this is why I do this. And so when I say, sir, ma'am, can you all understand why the other person is that way? And they say, yeah, of course. So what do? Well, let's set aside 2 budgets. Let's set aside a budget that is designed to make sure that we're ready for a rainy day. And let's set aside another budget so that we can plan for a vacation, because we don't just want to be slaves to our bank accounts. And lo and behold, we find something in there that meets both of their needs. Does this make sense so far, everyone? Okay. All right. So what I want us to do here is I want us to see if we can make a distinction between solvable and unsolvable problems. Okay. So looking at this questionnaire, assessing your marital conflicts, if we're looking at, I believe it's going to start with number 2 on there. So this is the one that has the questionnaire, assessing your marital conflicts. I want us to take a look at a few of this, and I want you all to be able to tell me if you believe that these are solvable problems, perpetual problems, or, let me see. Because this one actually looks like it has different ones than the ones that I originally had printed out for myself. And so bear with me 1 second to see if I can catch these. Okay. Actually, there was one other one that was actually supposed to be printed out, and I'm not sure if it got printed because this is actually not the same one that was printed. Okay. All right. So here's what I will do. If you'll give me 1 second, I'm going to see if I can do this off of my laptop, because then I actually do have the questions here. I always have to make sure I have backups, because things like this can happen. Okay. Okay, so I'll just have to read the examples to you, and then you all will have to give me your verbal answers, because this one actually is a different one. Please use that, but that's not going to be the one we're using here today. So I want to give you an example of a problem that is has an element where it could be a solvable problem, and it could be something where they can actually make some compromises. So here's one example. It says, usually when you come home from your sales job, you're tired from work, and you have to be on all day, and all you want to do is play video games, but your partner, whose job entails far more interaction with computers than people, craves connection. One night, she gets very angry and she tries to talk to you, but you don't want to peel your eyes away from the screen. You tell her you're tired of chatting, but she yells, well, what about me? I will go crazy if I can't talk about my day. What's the reasonable part of the request? So one way to discern the reasonable part of the request is to be able to recognize where she is trying to say, I want to talk about my day. So something that you can say in response, if we're making some of those repair attempts, is saying, I'm sorry, what if you give me about a half hour to chill out, and then we can talk? So this would be an example of finding what's that reasonable part of the request and what is a way in which we can compromise to make an agreement. All right. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to read off a couple of these, and I want you to see if you can figure out what is the reasonable part of the request that the person is making, and what is something that you can say in response. So I don't know if your papers actually have a place to take a note here, but I'll read off the first one, and then I'll see if I can get a little bit of feedback from you all about how you might solve this particular one. All right, the first one says, you pride yourself on being an unsentimental person. Your partner, however, wants you to make a fuss over a multitude of events, their birthday, Valentine's Day, your anniversary, etc. And on their birthday, they express hurt that you didn't plan a party and says that they were forced to make plans for themselves. You say birthday celebrations are for children. They say, why can't you just give me what I want? Why is this such a big deal? All right, so the first thing I want you to be able to jot down is, what is the reasonable part of the request? What is the reasonable part of the request that's being made there? All right. All right. Okay, so wanting something on a special occasion, wanting something special on a special occasion. All right, so then what would be a way to compromise on that? What would be a compromise that one might come up with? And we could just throw some ideas out there. What's a good compromise that you might be able to come up with? If maybe you're somebody who's not prone to celebrating every single holiday like Valentine, or every single occasion like Valentine's Day and anniversaries, what might be a compromise? Yes. Alternate. So like alternate. All right, so maybe we can alternate, and we can just pick a couple out of it. Yeah.
Go out to dinner. It's a win-win.
Right. Yes, go out to dinner. Find some sort of occasion where it's something that you both can do together that's special for them, and also something that you might enjoy that allows you to unwind.
Have a list of pre-approved things that they will like, and then select one.
Pre-approved list, I like it. No, but these are actually problem-solving skills that they talk about. Is like, how can we find what's present and what would be ideal, and then find something that's somewhere in between for both of those. All right, any other thoughts about what you might say? Yes? Yes, plan the event together, right? So if it's something that you plan together, it's more likely that whatever you come up with is going to be something that lands somewhere in the middle here. All right, read just two more of these, and we'll do two more of these examples, and then we'll come back to it. So, oh, yes?
I'd say flowers are always
Flowers
good.
are always good, yeah. Yes, yeah, that's one of those big hints. Jewelry, flowers or jewelry, right, all right. So I suppose taking notes over there, yes, flowers, okay. All right. All right, so number two, the example there. So sorry this didn't get printed. I probably didn't attach the correct one, so my apologies about that. And I'll see if we can print it before you all leave today, just so you can maybe go over a few of these examples. Number two says, your partner's upset that you didn't check with them before accepting a dinner invitation from your friends, Matt and Sally. And your partner can't stand eating at their place because they think that Sally is over-focused on health foods and dietary supplements. So partner says to you, tell them we can't come. Your partner insists. Okay, what is the reasonable part of that request? What can you pick out of that sounds like a reasonable request? Talk about it first. Yes. All right, anybody else have any thoughts? What else might be a reasonable piece of that? Yes. Find a new friend and go there. Yeah, well, depends how close you are to Matt, right? Yeah, Matt and Sally. Have them come to your house. Yes, well. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if they'll actually make a steak and see if they'll eat it. That could effectively result in what your significant other might be looking for, and that would be the end of that friendship, right? All right. So the reasonable part of the request would be here that we should talk first so that we can kind of brace each other for this. Like, it is tough sometimes if you have to be around folks that you have a hard time, finding conversation with. I mean, I'm not a big fan of awkward moments, and I can be very awkward at times, as people close to me can attest to. And if I can be prepared for that, that actually helps me out quite a bit. So what is something that you might be able to say as a negotiating piece here? What's something that you can say in this particular moment that might help? Do you have any thoughts? Mm-hmm.
I feel uncomfortable with just how obsessive the woman or man is about. So maybe we could just go to a restaurant and have a short encounter, not in, like,
Right.
so you could compromise.
Right.
Like at a restaurant, then you
Right.
leave when you want.
Right, so then more neutral ground. Yeah, and there's some background noise, like I can't hear what you're talking about.
We have been
Yeah.
in that situation where we have friends that are really picky about food, and I mean, crazy, crazy about washing their hands, obsessive. So we have friends like that.
Yes, right. So you find the neutral ground, right? So so if I didn't hear that, you find some neutral ground where you can actually spend that time together while still hanging out with the friends, but having an exit plan so you can, pull the parachute if you need to or hit the emergency button, right? Yeah, it's easier to leave a restaurant sometimes than someone's house. All right. So let me read off for you just a couple of the examples that are given here, some response. So the first one, the reasonable part of of your partner's request is that they deserve to feel special at least some of the time. So you can say, I see why you'd want these times to be special. Can we select 2 or 3 of them and make them big celebrations, kind of like what you had mentioned, right? So pick a few of those and see if we can make those special. I'll try to see if I can get that back up. I think it did that because I navigated away from the screen, but I'll see if I can get that back up on the screen. But these parts are not up there just yet. For number 2, the one that we just went over, look at the reasonable part of the second request is, your significant other does, the friend does deliver sermons about food, and it can be hard to take. So you might say something like, I understand why you feel that way about Sally, but she was really generous to us when we first moved into the neighborhood, and I really like Matt. How about if I make sure that it's not just Matt and me talking and you being left with Sally, and I promise to check with you before making any more plans for the 4 of us. So you just make sure that they don't ever get cornered by fanatical Sally. And then, of course, you have to follow through with that piece. You can't just leave them to the wolves if this is how that goes. So these are ways to make these kinds of compromises with each other. And so, like I said, I'll give this as a sample because these are ways that we can follow that first principle of accepting influence. All right, and in terms of finding out whether or not the problem is solvable, a solvable problem or a perpetual problem, I had some samples that I wanted for us to be able to go over, but I guess I didn't make it on there. So I'm going to see if I can at least read off some of these ones. All right, so now the second one is going to be telling the difference. So we were just looking at ways that you can accept influence, but on this next one, we're going to see if we can get to the place where we can tell the difference between a solvable or a perpetual problem. And let me see if I can get back over to our slides. Okay. Yeah. Looks like quite the climb, too. All right, let's see if I can pull that back up again. Okay. All right, so that went one too far. Okay, so looking at the types of conflict. All right, so I'm just going to read you an example. So remember what we said about the gridlock problems or the seemingly unsolvable problems are the ones where it makes you feel rejected. It seems like you don't make headway. They seem like ones that are really entrenched in history and in the person's temperament, things that are unlikely to change. So I just want to see if I can give you just a few examples of this. First of all, there's an example of Cliff and Lynn. So Cliff and Lynn agree that it's Cliff's job to take out the kitchen trash every evening after dinner, but lately he's been so distracted by a big deadline looming at work that he forgets. Either Lynn ends up throwing out the garbage herself, or the trash just sits there, and by the morning, the apartment smells like a city dump, and Lynn is in a rage. All right, would you say that that is a solvable problem, or does that seem like a perpetual problem? Solvable problem. All right, why do you think so? Okay, so she doesn't have to get angry about the trash, and maybe it's just because it's just the trash. This seems really petty, you said? Yeah. Okay, so it seems like it's a petty thing.
Not necessarily petty.
Right. So it can become a bigger problem, right? He keeps forgetting to take out the trash. Now, one clue here that this is probably a solvable problem. It doesn't mean it's not a problem at all, but the reason that it might be a solvable problem is there's probably not deep-seated history behind the trash not being taken out. It'd be that's possible, but that's not likely. I probably should not say anything out loud. I have not had anybody traumatized by trash not being taken out.
Why can't she take it out?
Right. Well, that might drive the conflict deeper. But yes, yeah, it's something that they could figure out between each other. So in this particular case, Cliff agreed to take out the trash. And so, yeah, certainly if he wasn't going to agree, then that probably wouldn't be. So in this particular case, this is a solvable problem. It's not up there. Oh, I'm sorry, question.
I was just thinking it's solvable because his job stress is temporary.
Yes, right. The job stress can be temporary, right? And like a trash thing can be kind of negotiated that like, hey, we can find better ways to remind ourselves. The stress at the work can be temporary. Yeah, there's a lot of things that can easily shift to make that problem not so perpetual. So yes, you all are correct. All right, second one here. Let's see if we can remain all stars so far, because this is a good one for one. So in this one, Elise wants to spend less time with Joel and spend more time with her friends. Joel says this makes him feel abandoned. Elise says that she needs time away from him. He seems very needy to her, and she is feeling suffocated by him. Do you think this is a perpetual problem or a solvable problem? Solvable? Perpetual? Anyway, perpetual? Anyone else? Right? All right. So this is indeed a perpetual problem. And one of your big clues here is the way that it makes him feel. Like when you hear words like someone feels abandoned, that is unlikely going to be just a solvable problem. Like this is something that's like has some internal history around it. This is going to be something that they actually feel is occurring to them, and probably there's going to be some history around feeling abandoned in the past. And when I've had people say things like this, it usually goes pretty deep. And so it's not something that necessarily gets solved by just simply coming up with a problem-solving strategy of, well, we'll just go out to eat once a week. Because I'll tell you exactly what will happen. They will go out to eat once a week, and then the other person who's there will be frustrated and resentful, like, okay, well, I got to spend time with you, and I can't hang out with my friends, and I just got to sit here and just, yeah. So that kind of thing, that's not really helpful. And the person who's being treated that way knows that they're being patronized, and so they're not particularly happy about it, and so it remains an entrenched problem until we deal with the history. So yes, that would be an example of a perpetual problem. All right, number 3, Ingrid does not like that Gary sulks when he's upset with her, rather than telling her what's bothering him. But when he does let her know all the reasons he's unhappy, she criticizes him for bringing up so many issues at once. That never happened to anybody before, right? He says that since it's so hard for him to discuss things, he doesn't want Ingrid to criticize his style of communication when he does acknowledge he's upset with her. Instead, he wants a reward. Namely, he wants Ingrid to say she is sorry. You think this is perpetual or solvable problem? Yes?
Perpetual. We have two different, they each have their own forces that are coming at each other.
Right. Very good. And in fact, does anybody know which horsemen are probably coming out there? So there's criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Yeah, so you have the defensiveness there. You have probably a little bit of contempt there about how he talks, and she doesn't like how he talks, and so you always talk this way, I don't like your way of communicating, that this can be some of those four horsemen. Yes? Yeah. All right, so the number 4, we'll just do one more example here, and we'll see if we can make this distinction. Because if you can make this distinction here, then you can also start to think about the discussions that you have. Now, the good thing about these skills is that these are true even when these skills are actually effective even when you're just talking about everyday relationships. These skills actually come into play because you can start to recognize whether or not it's just a regular solvable problem or an unsolvable one. So the last one here is we have the example of Helena, who gets together with their friends every Monday night. Jonathan wants to take her ballroom dancing class together with him, but the class is only held on Monday nights. Helena doesn't want to give up her girls' night out. Do you think this is a solvable or a perpetual problem? Right. All right. Now, why is it solvable? Anybody want to take it? Right, exactly, right? So there's an easy way to rotate that. There's not these deep-seated feelings that are really driving this issue. So does this make sense in terms of discerning between the two? So if you can recognize this, you can actually begin to make your conversations flow a lot more in a lot more healthy and productive manner. All right. Okay, so the next one that I want us to take a look at here are making repairs. Making repairs. When we are going to make repairs, we have to recognize what kind of things that we're getting into. So we talked a little bit about the signs of gridlock, but in making repairs, there's going to be these several steps here. And one of them that I really wanted to focus a little bit of attention on is forgiveness. Forgiveness is something that is often, I believe, overlooked and underrated in terms of its effectiveness. In fact, there's a gentleman, his name is Everett Washington, and he has actually been studying forgiveness for nearly a decade. And when he was faced, after he was studying this for about a decade, he was faced with his own situation where he had to deal with forgiveness. In his particular case, his mother was murdered in a home invasion, and though the police were confident they had identified the perpetrator, the man was never prosecuted. So, might be a little difficult to forgive in that situation, yes? And so because he had spent the better part of 10 years studying how to forgive, he actually applied some of these strategies, and I believe forgiveness is one of the best repair attempts that you can make. In Gottman's book, he doesn't necessarily focus so much on this one, so this one's just some additional free information to be able to use here. So what he had done is, through applying his own, by applying these principles that he had come up with, he said that he applied this forgiveness model, but he never had to apply it to such a big event. So here's what he says. As it turned out, I was able to forgive the young man quite quickly. Now, wouldn't you be curious to know what in the world you would do in order to get to the place where you can actually forgive someone for murdering your parent? I think most of us should be curious about that. Well, let me just share just a couple of things with you really quickly about forgiveness and what effect it has on people. One of the things they found is that when people are able to engage in forgiveness, their physical and psychological well-being are greatly enhanced by it. Some people think that forgiveness is just letting go or moving on, but there's more to it than that. Bob Enright, a PhD psychologist from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who pioneered the study of forgiveness for 3 decades ago, he said, true forgiveness goes a step further, and that's a step further than just letting go and moving on. He says, it goes to offering something positive, empathy, compassion, and understanding toward the person who hurt you, the elements that make forgiveness both a virtue and a powerful construct in positive psychology. Outside of scientific circles, people are still a bit confused about the concept. And I think one of the things that people get confused here is that forgiveness is not the same thing as justice. You can forgive somebody, but that is not dismissing someone from justice. This does not mean I can forgive somebody who, there's this really beautiful example of this man whose son was killed at the door by a couple of young men. Actually, one of them was, I believe he was 14 or 16 years old. And it was a gang initiation, and they essentially ordered a pizza from this guy, and when he had come to the door, they took the pizza from him, and they shot him and killed him, like murdered him in cold blood. They were eventually caught and arrested, and I believe the 16-year-old was tried as an adult. And the father sat and had his opportunity to say something to the court about, just to make an impact statement. And in his impact statement, he said that the night that my son was killed, I was not the only person who lost something that day. My son was a very loving young man who had a very promising future. He was a good son. I loved him with everything that I have. But he's not the only person that lost something that day, because that day, my son didn't just lose his life. This man who's killed him is also losing his life today as well. And I want him to know that even though he has done this crime, and he's going to be serving this time in jail, that I forgive him. And he looks at him and says, I forgive you for killing my son. And then the man, after hearing this, he asked the judge, can I say something? And then he looked at the man and said, I do not understand how someone who has had their son murdered can actually extend forgiveness to someone like me. And he went on to talk about how, as a result of that, he wanted to make himself a better man to justify the fact that this man's father was forgiving him. And then he asked if he can shake the man's hand. And the father came over to him, and as he was shaking his hand, he hugged him, and you see the man break down in tears. and acknowledged that he deserved being in prison, but said that because the Father could forgive him, it felt like there was some hope for him to change. Forgiveness is perhaps one of the most powerful and profound ways to heal conflict. And as we said in the beginning, conflicts offer themselves opportunities for connection. And I guarantee you that the connection that that man made with his son's murderer is one that is still lasting today. So, and some of the steps towards forgiveness, he actually lists a few of those that I think we probably won't have enough time for this evening, but if anybody's interested in that, I can definitely try to send you some information on it. But just the quick version of the steps that he talks about for the forgiveness of others is an acronym called REACH, where the first one is to R, recall the hurt. The second one is to empathize with the other person. That is to try to put yourself in that other person's chair. This does not mean that you justify what they did, but if you can understand where they were coming from when they did it. The third one is giving that altruistic gift, to give forgiveness in an unselfish and altruistic way. The fourth one is to commit. Once you have forgiven, one of the things they suggest is writing a note to yourself, and something like, today I forgave, and whoever that was for hurting me. This helps the forgiveness to last. And the fifth step there is to hold on to that forgiveness. This is something that we go back and we revisit often so that we do not find ourselves perpetually revisiting the same scars over and over again. All right, I know that's a little bit heavy, but hopefully still useful nevertheless, because these are the things that help a relationship to move forward. So one of the texts that always strikes me and comes to mind is probably one that you know very well, and this is like in Luke chapter 23 and verse 34, where you have Jesus saying to those who are killing him, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And it's very interesting that he says it that way, because there was something that they did not know. And what they didn't know wasn't the crime that they were committing. They knew exactly what kind of crime they were committing. What they didn't know was who they were committing the crime to, and what the implications of what they were doing had. It's similar to the young man who was sitting in court. If he could have known that man's father, and if he could have known what that son was like, and if he actually got to know that kid as a person, he never would have shot him. That's what he didn't know. And that's what the people who crucified their Savior did not know. And thus he said, forgive them because they don't know, which means he was empathizing with his persecutors. All right. Heavy stuff. All right. So, forgiveness. The other steps to helping a conflict not to get completely out of control is the soft startups. So soft startups are ways to shift how you are communicating to the person. In a soft startup, one of the things that they say is to complain but don't blame. Complain but don't blame. So remember, like, using I statements. So you can hear the difference between the two. There's a big difference between you're not listening to me versus I would like it if you would listen to me. Shifts the entire sense of the words that are being spoken. Or you're careless with your money versus I want us to save more. One comes across as an attack and an accusation, the second one as a request to collaborate. The third one, a third example of this is saying, like, you just don't care about me. That usually doesn't go over too well, because if you're saying that to somebody, you're accusing them of being heartless. This is criticism, this is contempt. Versus saying, I'm feeling neglected. Make statements that start with I instead of you. Describe, the second one, the second step to a soft startup is describe what's happening. Don't evaluate or judge. Just describe what's actually happening. Like, this has been a really difficult day, versus you're making everything worse, I can't count on you for anything. Being able to describe, this day has been really difficult because I was hoping that X, Y, and Z would have happened and it didn't. Describe what is happening. Next one is be clear about your positive need. Don't expect your spouse or partner to be a mind reader. Instead of, you left the kitchen a total mess, you might say, I'd appreciate it if you would clean your stuff off the kitchen table. So because your spouse is not always going to be thinking the same things that you are, actually tell them what you are thinking, but say it in a way that can be understood. Third one is be polite. I hope that's self-explanatory in terms of how we address each other, be polite. The fourth is be appreciative. Find something that you can be appreciative about when you're starting something up, or when you're starting a conversation, like, hey, I recognize you're probably tired from work. I really appreciate that you do a lot to try to support the family, and I need you to watch the kids for a minute because I'm exhausted. Be appreciative. Number 4 is don't store things up, which was one of the questions that we had there, because the more you store things up, the more that begins to have a tail on your body. The second thing that happens is if you keep storing it up, guess what happens if you haven't talked about something in 10 days, but you've been bothered for 10 days about it? Has it gotten smaller? Yeah, that's exactly right. It's kind of like you keep blowing air in this balloon. It's not getting smaller every time you puff air into it. It may be concealed, but it's going to pop. And so don't just store things up. There's a text in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26 that tells us to be angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down on your wrath. I really like this one because there is nothing wrong with being angry. The problem is when we allow our anger to cause us to say mean and hurtful things to one another, or cause us to sin, to use the biblical term. The second thing it says here is let not the sun go down on your wrath. Now I want you to notice the difference between these two words. There is a difference between anger and wrath, right? And one of the things that turns anger into wrath is when something gets pent up, or when the anger itself gets fanned and made worse. So we don't want to just make the mistake of, when we talk about something, just building things up more and more and more, because that's just going to set things on a much harder track. And we also don't want to go on the other track of just storing things up and compressing them. What you want to be able to do is come to some kind of reasonable negotiation about how we're going to resolve this. Okay. So the last couple of things here are repair attempts. When you see that your significant other is making some kind of repair attempt, be accepting of it. If you hear a joke come out, or if you hear, and not like a joke at your expense, but you hear the person trying to say something like an I'm sorry or something, take those repair attempts and go with them. Like, make those things worth something. If you see that your spouse is trying to keep the discussion going in a positive direction, go with it. If they say, hey, I need you to be a little more gentle with me, use that as an opportunity to continue the conversation. Don't say, well, that's too bad, you're never gentle with me. That's not really going to be very helpful. Catch those repair attempts and run with them. One of the second to last ones is to soothe yourself. Learn how to take deep breaths, how to really calm. There are ways to actually do that. In fact, one way that's taken for granted is forcing yourself to yawn. If you actually intentionally yawn, you all can do this right now. Hopefully it's not a real one, but you can actually force yourself to take in a deep yawn. When you do that, it actually calms your nervous system. You're very unlikely to yawn when you're elevated. Right. So yeah, timing is key. If it's something that you both recognize, and I'm saying like, hey, I'm going to try some of these, like you can announce it at first. Yeah. So you don't want to just like, yes, thank you. Yeah. So you don't want to make that part of it. You can do this in a way that doesn't express contempt. And one of the things that's really suggested is when you make a repair attempt, is sometimes even just saying like, hey, I'm trying to repair this before we go off the side of the cliff. That's fine too. Just anything to say to your significant other or to your friend or whoever you're speaking to, like, hey, I'm trying to fix this before we go off the edge here. Anything that you can do to announce that, be accepting of those things, and be willing to put them out there so that the person feels like there's some hope in keeping the conversation move forward. And the last one, of course, is compromise. Be willing to make those compromises, just like we were talking about in our early exercise there. Find out what that middle ground is for each other. All right. So for all the rest of it, all these things that are up here, they're actually in the handouts. They get into detail about how to do these things. I try to make sure that I'm giving you enough examples and illustrations so that you can see what these things look like. But as I said from the beginning, a lot of this is going to be homework because there's so many things to cover in such a short amount of time. So you have 2 handouts that are going to be that should be taken with you today. And the first one is the aftermath of a fight. It actually talks about how to go through repair attempts. It even gives specific examples of things that you can say to make a repair in a relationship or after an argument has occurred, like for the person who was on the side of trying to express what was going on, you might have some statements about being able to share how it was that I felt in this particular moment. Really try to listen to each other. So this one goes through step by step of being able to state what the feelings are and what they were about, being able to explain each of your realities, like this is the reality I was experiencing in this conversation, what was yours? As Dan Siegel was quoted saying, everybody is subject to having their own perceptions of what happens, but nobody is capable of immaculate perception, as he called it. Everyone's perceptions are going to be colored by their own histories. There are no immaculate perceptions. No one's perceptions of reality are perfect. And so if you can recognize that about yourself and about each other, then you can keep things moving forward. Okay. All right. So please check those ones out. This one gives some steps on that. The second one, the second handout for this evening is on the Four Horsemen. We kind of slightly touched on this, but this one on the Four Horsemen talks about ways to reverse those four horsemen when they come into the relationship, around criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling, and some ways to directly address and deal with those. Okay, all right, so for anyone here, anyone have any questions about what we've talked about this evening so far? We've just looked at these two major principles here of how to accept influence from one another and how to manage some of these unsolvable problems, and recognizing the distinction between both of those. We're going to get a lot more into the unsolvable problems next time, because that gets into the dreams and how to recognize when those dreams are a part of why the conflict is so difficult. But did anyone have any questions before we close for this evening? All right. Hopefully not feeling too much like you're drinking water out of a fire hydrant this evening. So, yes.
Well, like, is it, I mean, I don't want to, is it more, are men less likely to apologize than women?
Yeah, the short answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. It's not, and a lot of it has to do with accepting influence. So it's right back to that earlier. So like 69%, I think it was, what was it? Yeah, about 69% of the time, men are unlikely to accept influence. And part of that accepting influence is going to tie directly into accepting some culpability in whatever the problem was. Because it's like, well, you're just getting yourself all upset about that, so I'm not going to apologize about something you did to yourself. And so that kind of mentality will tend toward that. Now, it's not 100%, roles can be flipped. Sometimes the man is the one that's more likely to apologize. The woman has a difficult time saying, I'm sorry. But it goes back to that accepting influence piece. If you're able to accept influence, it's much easier to also accept that element of responsibility that, like, something I did contributed to how you feel. So, all right. Any other questions before we close? And if not, then if you have other questions and you think of them later, please feel free to write them down on the little cards that we have in the back, or to submit them online, because you can either go onto our Facebook page and submit them there, and we'll be monitoring those questions as well, or to email them directly to our church. Any one of those methods will be effective in doing that. But for this evening, let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer, and we'll dismiss. Our Father in heaven, I just thank you for this opportunity to be able to talk about the principles that help marriage to work. I know there was a few parts today that were a little bit choppy from not having everything printed out the way that we wanted to, but Lord, I thank you that we had a chance to still go through these anyway. And I pray that the materials that we have tonight will be a blessing to everyone that is here. And for those who are not able to attend, Lord, I pray that they would be able to begin applying these principles to experience marriage the way that you intended. And I just ask for these blessings in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, well, many blessings, and hopefully you can see you all again next Friday. It'll be our last night, and we will be covering the last two principles for